To today's holding court. So excited to be here with all of you. We're going to wait just a minute for folks to come on in to join us today, and I hope you're all doing well on this very beautiful October day. As a bit of a preview of where my head's at, I'm getting married in 10 days. So if anyone has any ideas on how to bottle today's weather and move it to the 15th, that would be my personal preference. So you know that I'm excited for this conversation because it is peak wedding planning season in my brain, and that is all I have is just wedding planning and cobwebs in this brain. How are you guys doing?
Doing well. Don't have wedding planning in the brain.
Mazel
Just
tov.
for stuff generally. So I feel excited and somewhat prepared to talk about this topic because I feel like I'm always talking about it. So yeah, there's been a lot of Beyonce though for me in the past couple of months. So not the same, but that's probably been the most exciting thing. I don't
I
know.
mean, you got an outfit plan for that in a real way.
Yeah.
What
Gosh,
about
I'm
you, Rachel?
jealous that you have so much Beyonce in your life, Tristin. I did not get to go to Renaissance, but I'll be first in line at AMC for the movie. I'm excited to be here. I'm really excited. I love working with People's Parity Project and Rising Organizers. I'm really excited to be on this panel with y'all and talk about the courts, especially talk about some of the lower courts, the state courts as well. As like just like Tristin, I'm always talking about those too. And I'm really excited to be on a panel with y'all. Yeah.
And I'm always talking about organizing. So by our powers combined, we will save American democracy. Let's get into it. So thanks to everybody who's been joining while we've been chatting. My name is Elyssa Feder. I am the executive director of Rising Organizers. Rising Organizers fights for a pluralistic, just democratic system by ensuring everyday people know how to organize in your communities, and fights for a government that is representative of and responsive to the people. So I'm really excited to be your moderator here today, and I'm excited to be here with some friends from People's Parity Project and Alliance for Justice. I'm going to have them introduce themselves and their conversation in just a minute. But so today's conversation is part of our ongoing series, Holding Court, Justice Conversations with AFJ. This is an AFJ hosted project. Thanks for having us. And it features this series features leading activists, scholars, and attorneys to discuss current political and social justice issues. So we're really excited to be turning our collective eye to organizing in the courts today. And I'm honored to have Rachel Bracken and Tristin Brown here for our conversation. Incredibly timely conversation since the new term of the court just started this past Monday and things are already afoot. So it's a perfect time to dive into how the courts will impact future generations. So I would love for each of you to introduce yourselves, introduce your organizations, and we'll get the panel started. So why don't we start with Rachel, and then Tristin, I'll kick it over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. And apologies for any dogs that you might hear in the background. They were sound asleep before we started. And as soon as we said we're going live, they just love the camera, I think.
That's how it works.
But my name is Rachel Bracken. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently a senior regional state court manager here at Alliance for Justice. In this capacity, I'm charged with AFJ's involvement in state Supreme Court selection across and throughout the Southeast, but then also temporarily for this year in Pennsylvania, which has a critical election coming up in just a month, actually, for their state's highest court, along with every office down to their school boards. But here at AFJ, we've been here for over 40 years as a membership organization, advocating and empowering both nonprofits and individuals around to engage in our democracy and ensure that our courts are fair and representative and truly live up to their principles of equal justice. I'm really excited to talk about this with y'all. Tristin, I'll throw it over to you.
Before I introduce myself, just going to say we love dogs, especially dogs who are also passionate about democracy in court. So no problem there. But hey, everyone, it's a little weird because we can't see you all, but y'all can see us. But I'm Tristin Brown. I'm the Policy and Program Director at People's Parity Project, which is a nationwide network of mostly law students and lawyers organizing against the conservative capture of our courts. We have law student chapters and lawyers chapters across the country who engage in campaigns and projects that are respected perspective to their campus communities, local communities, and what's happening in their state. So I too, as has already been mentioned multiple times, I'm really excited about this conversation, particularly because we have this focus on just kind of the intersection between the law and the importance of organizing. And I think at PPP, that's kind of right where we fall in. So excited to have this conversation, and I'll pass it back to you, Elyssa.
Wonderful. So these are our amazing panelists. I'm going to say that I'm also excited again because this is just such a fun time. I'm so excited to get to hang out with you all and talk about this very important problem. And I also want to say that we want this to be a conversation. So folks who are watching, drop your questions, your comments. We have a lot of time for Q&A. So if we don't get to your question at the moment you drop it in, don't worry, we have a space for it, but I don't want you to feel like you have to hold your question back if something really strikes you. So drop it in the comments, drop it in the replies if you're watching on a different platform, and we will get to them as soon as we can. With all of that said, would love to jump right into it with you two. So first question, when you look at the state of our courts right now, and we're going to be talking about federal and state, what are some of the greatest opportunities and challenges that you see, and why are these opportunities and challenges particularly important?
I'm happy to take a stab at it first. I think that a lot of the greatest challenges have presented some of the greatest opportunities in recent years, especially as it pertains to the Supreme Court specifically. I don't think that it's a surprise or particularly shocking to us, or probably a lot of the folks watching, that a huge challenge right now, at least with the Supreme Court, is just kind of inherently its composition. Right now, we have this 6-3 conservative supermajority that has shown time and time again in the relatively short period of time that it has been in existence, a really shocking willingness to just kind of like overturn their own precedent. In law school, you learn about this principle of stare decisis, which is synonymous with precedent, which is just like, okay, a case has been decided, especially at the highest level, and like that's just the law. Like rarely is it a situation where a court, or especially the Supreme Court, is going back on a law it has already, or a question it's already answered. But that has not been the case here. I'll say as a result of that, it's been encouraging to see just kind of this veil of opaqueness almost being lifted off of the court. For as long as I can remember, I feel like the Supreme Court has been this institution that really has not had a lot of transparency, that's also almost been deified, especially in academic circles, where, it just was not really common to even question the legitimacy of the institution. I think that has not been the case recently. There have been, especially as we'll talk about in this conversation, almost on a weekly basis, ProPublica is like releasing a report about what new ethical violations it has uncovered from particular justices on the court. But because of that, we've kind of found ourselves in a situation where there's a lot of public education that can be done and that has been done to raise awareness on a lot of these reforms that folks have been proposing as it relates to court specifically. I think there was a poll out that showed nearly 70% of folks having approval of court ethical reforms at the court. The Supreme Court is like the only court that does not have a binding code of ethics or a code of conduct, which may explain why they are just kind of like recklessly, lawlessly, maybe even just doing their business. But we've also seen a lot of other proposals as it relates to structural court reform measures, which I don't think is something we've seen or been comfortable to talk about, at least openly, in recent years. I think term limits is a great example. There have been multiple pieces of legislation that have been introduced to kind of curb how long the justices can serve on the court. Court expansion has been another one that's been I think really in the last 2 to 3 years has kind of moved more into the mainstream conversation. I feel like when I was in law school, you couldn't really bring that up without like being taken to the town square. But now it's a conversation that's being had. Demand Justice, I think yesterday released a poll from Marquette showing, I think maybe over 50% or like 54% of people being in support of court expansion, which is like a pretty huge deal. I think the same can be said about things like lower court expansion, forum shopping, judge shopping, all of these things that have been topics that usually have been kind of like insulated in advocacy circles, academic circles, but now kind of piercing the public conversation a bit more, which I think is a really, really huge organizing opportunity. So I'll stop there and pass it to Rachel or Elyssa or whoever wants to answer first.
Oh my gosh, I could listen to you talk about the Supreme Court and our federal courts all day, Tristin. But I think you're exactly right in terms of just all these challenges being incredible opportunities for organizing, mobilization, and advocacy around the courts. What we've seen, what all of these roots, I think the root of this issue is coming down to the increased politicization that our courts are facing, both at the federal level and the state level. Federally, though, our rights are being taken away from us, but state courts are acting as a huge opportunity for organizing and voter education and really creating an engaged public around these institutions. I think that while the Supreme Court has been extremely demystified, a lot of people don't recognize the power that their local state courts actually have. Just next year, I believe it's 32 states have state court elections, have at least one seat up for election on their state Supreme Court. And these courts have been the remaining bulwark for our constitutional rights and freedoms, kind of at the extreme federal rollback that we've been seeing kind of at the federal level. So 95% of all cases are filed in state courts that are filed in the United States. And so there's so much more opportunity for change and institutional change, whereas I feel like for federal appointments, they are there for a lifetime, whereas state-based ones, they are more so term limited. So that's an incredible opportunity for change, for organizing, for advocacy and coalition building right there.
Amazing. Yeah, let's jump into talking about organizing in particular, because it is this really big term that means lots of different things to lots of folks. Sometimes you know it when you see it, not to make a Supreme Court reference right off the bat, but you really want to think about, I want to get into what it means to each of us and what it means for the context of our organizations. At Rising Organizers, it's in the name. So we have to talk about what organizing is all the time. And we have a really broad definition about organizing being bringing people together to fight for a more just and democratic system, one where the majority's perspective is being represented. From my perspective, this is where this particular issue becomes incredibly salient for our work, because Tristin's brought a lot of polls to this conversation already. I should have brought my own, but there are a number of studies that have shown that the Supreme Court is really out of step with where the majority of Americans are on policy. And to me, that is a sign of the challenges facing our current democratic system. People need to feel like their government actually represents them and is not just telling them things that are out of line with their views and their values. So when we talk about organizing at Rising Organizers, what we're trying to do is make sure that more people know what it is, how they can get involved in doing it, the impact that organizing can have, the distinction between organizing and other types of work that they might see, and we can get into all of that. But I would love to, and Rachel, maybe we'll start with you. I'll try and go back and forth between the two of you. What does organizing mean in your work? How are you thinking about it at this moment in time?
For sure. Thank you. Organizing is just essential, I think, to state courts' work no matter what. I think for so long, these courts have operated kind of in the background and in the shadow of our federal system. And so now I think we're at a moment where people are really realizing the actual power and actually understanding that they can have an impact on their state courts, not even electorally, but also in appointment-based states as well. So at the state level, just organizing for elections is just critical. Without that critical voter education around these elections, that they're actually even happening or that judges are elected in the first place, then we don't have an informed public to actually participate and make our democracy as full as it can be and as a representative as it can be. And so I think also in terms of electoral states, that education and organizing is so critical because there are two types of elections that state Supreme Courts can have. They can either have nonpartisan elections or partisan, which means that in partisan ones, they have a party identification on the ballot, which I think a lot of voters tend to rely on when they are there. But in terms of nonpartisan elections, that's not there. So sometimes people either get disengaged, they don't vote in those types of offices or don't vote down ballot like that, or even worse, they just guess, I think, and make an uninformed vote, and which can be very detrimental to our democracy and our court system and our judiciary, period. That being said, I think also in terms of organizing, in terms of like bringing in broad coalitions, those are critical for other intervention points in terms of advocacy with governors' offices, with state senates and state legislatures in terms of if they have responsibilities of confirming the appointees or the nominees, for example. And those are some really critical opportunities that we need to ensure like that people are aware of, and also other groups are engaged in, because we need to be able to meet the moments, and especially when they matter. So I'm really happy to talk about, I don't want to take up too much time, and I want to make sure Tristin has a moment to answer, but for example, like in Connecticut, where there was a vacancy and People's Parity Project was incredible on that in terms of being on it and organizing groups around this vacancy on the Connecticut Supreme Court. There was a former nominee, Sandra Slack Glover, who Governor Lamont had originally appointed, but then we had seen in research of her record had previously supported Amy Coney Barrett. I think she might be familiar to some people on this call or watching this call right now, and had supported her nomination to the Supreme Court, which actually raised some serious questions, I think, about her record, about her judgments. And so in that way, People's Parity Project, along with other organizations like AFJ, organized to really challenge, I think, that nomination. We were able to organize and form a coalition to step in at a critical intervention point, which was the confirming body, and raise our concerns. And in that, we defeated her nomination. And since Governor Lamont has nominated and was likely confirmed Nora Daney, I think is her last name, I might be pronouncing it wrong, who, though unfortunately does not necessarily represent, I think, the professional diversity that a lot of individuals were seeking to add to the Connecticut bench. But there's still a critical opportunity as a career prosecutor, but there's still a critical opportunity, I think, in terms of continuing to organize and build on that opportunity that we had for a lower court, a court of appeals vacancy in the state.
Tristin, go ahead.
Yeah, I know I mentioned earlier when I introduced myself and PPP, us being this nationwide network of law students and lawyers. And so the way that fits into our organizing work, we kind of feel that there is this huge responsibility specifically on lawyers and law students, because whether we have or earned this credibility that we have by virtue of like studying for and attaining a law degree, a lot of these issues that we're having within our courts that we'll continue to talk about throughout this conversation are problems that have been directly because of lawyers. And so our work is just kind of thinking about creative ways to shift the conversation, shift the culture that is present not only in our legal society, but also around the country in law schools. And so with our different chapters, as I mentioned, our organizing centers on some of that state court stuff. I know Rachel just mentioned the organizing that happened in Connecticut. New York is another example where earlier this year there was a nominee to the New York Court of Appeals, Hector LaSalle, who also had a pretty concerning record. And just to see a lot of lawyers specifically and law students, including folks who organize with PPP, jumping in on that fight to have that nomination ultimately defeated, and him being replaced, or at least his nomination being replaced with Ron Wilson, who now has been confirmed to be the chief judge, I think is an example of the importance of organizing, the importance, at least to us, of organizing within the legal community specifically to just try to shift and change the culture where law schools usually are just kind of like have this pipeline where we're sending law students to prosecutorial careers or corporate careers. And, you know, there have been studies that come out that have said that a lot of times those professional backgrounds have direct correlations into the court outcomes or holdings that we see. And so just trying to step in before we get to the lawyer part, and see what we can do through organizing to just kind of like shift that narrative and that conversation that's happening across campuses and that's happening just throughout legal culture in America.
Great. Thank you both. I want to talk a little bit about the process of joining a court, being on the court, and then I'm going to come back to this organizing conversation and talk about the role that organizing has played in that. But first, I want to set the stage for folks. So I know it could be a semester-long class, one that I'm very excited to attend, but can you briefly explain how the courts operate in the US and how judges and justices get to the bench? Now let's start with Tristin this time.
Yep. So I'll do federal, and Rachel will tackle the state side. So in the federal world, there are different tiers in our federal court system. So when we say lower federal courts, that's usually just referring to either lower federal district courts or lower federal circuit courts. And then you have the U.S. Supreme Court. And so as you can imagine, when someone brings litigation in federal court, usually that litigation is going to be filed first in a district court. I feel like folks probably, if you watch a lot of Law and Order, have heard a lot of like the Southern District of New York. That's an example of a lower federal district court where a case can be filed. If a party, which usually happens, is unsatisfied with that outcome, they can appeal that ruling to the next level, which would be a circuit court. Circuit courts, we have 13 of those in our legal system, and they are based on just geographic jurisdiction. And so multiple states make up one particular circuit. And so based on whatever state you live in or whatever state your case has been filed in, that will determine what circuit it should be appealed to. And then folks who don't like the outcomes at circuit levels can file for writ of cert or appeal to the Supreme Court. It's very rare to have the Supreme Court accept your case. And we'll talk about, I think, why it's so interesting, the cases the Supreme Court decides to hear. They usually hear about a few dozen cases a year. So it's pretty rare to have something go from the circuit court or a district court all the way to the Supreme Court. But that's just kind of the tier of federal courts in our American legal system. As far as judges and justices are concerned, unlike state courts, which Rachel will get into, federal courts are purely appointment based processes. And so we'll talk a lot about the professional diversity that's being called for in federal judges specifically, but what happens is a vacancy arises and the two senators from your respective state are expected to make a recommendation. A lot of senators have things like judicial nominating commissions where they have a ton of folks or a number of folks on a committee or a nominating commission who kind of come together with lists of names. And based on that, senators will make recommendations to the White House, who will then formally kind of make that nomination. That goes to the Senate Judiciary Committee where a confirmation hearing is held. I know it's just like so much. Where a confirmation hearing is held, and then ultimately a full floor vote will be held where a nominee is either confirmed or not. And that is pretty much how that goes in the federal world.
Rachel, go ahead.
Thank you. And so state courts, in terms of just how they operate in the United States, operate at pretty much in the same exact way as our federal courts do, except they handle significantly more cases than our federal system does. Just to kind of put it into perspective, about 100 million cases are filed at the state trial level every single year versus about 500,000 at the federal level. And that makes sense because there are so many more states and like state district courts like available, or trial level courts, and it makes sense. But that just means there are also so many more opportunities for your rights to come under fire or anything like that. They can be appealed in the same exact way. So a case will start at the trial court, then work its way up into the courts of appeals of the state or the intermediate appellate courts of the state, and then may all be appealed all the way up to the state Supreme Court. Some state Supreme Courts may have original jurisdiction over certain types of cases. So for example, some states might have their state Supreme Court have original jurisdiction over redistricting cases, for example, or they might have final say over election certification results or things along those lines, which I think we've seen the importance of state courts really emerge post the 2020 election on that front, especially. But it's the same exact way. State courts or state Supreme Courts even have shadow dockets, which if you're not familiar with, a shadow docket, especially at the Supreme Court level, is a docket in which the court doesn't have to issue like formal decisions or opinions, in which it normally does with the same level of transparency that we normally get of judges or justices signing on to opinions or dissents or concurrences. In these shadow dockets, the court can just deliver an opinion without any transparency about how the justices ruled, about what their rulings were, why, and everything like that. And so those same things that exist at the federal level also exist at the state level in terms of operation. That being said, the selection of state court judges varies so much from state to state. I mentioned a little bit earlier that they can either be elected in partisan or nonpartisan elections, but then they can also be appointment based as well. So you have solely gubernatorial appointment or appointment by the governor. So they can just pick someone that applies for it, and then they can just go for it. Or that being said, it can operate kind of similar to the federal courts, in which the governor has to choose from a slate brought to him by, or brought to them, sorry, by the judicial nominating commission. So that means that the commission's in charge of vetting, interviewing, and selecting whichever ones, or the governor may be able to come up with an appointment, and that appointment must be confirmed, like we saw in Connecticut or in New York, for example. That being said, there are also two outliers that don't use like merit selection, which would be like the confirming body with like the commission slate and everything like that. There are states that use, South Carolina and Virginia use legislative elections, which are kind of wonky and don't really apply as much to other states, but that just means that the legislatures in each state hold elections for and determine, and those bodies like elect the judges on there. That being said, I don't know if you heard that talk. That being said, also, I feel like, though, what we've seen this result in both at the state and federal level is a traditional pipeline of corporate attorneys and former prosecutors dominating these benches. To put it into perspective, 40% of state Supreme Court justices are former prosecutors, compared to just 11% of them being public defenders. Which means that there are really critical opportunities for, like, as we mentioned before, these intervention points or education and advocacy with these commissions, with counsel's office, with governor's councils, or even with the state reps that are confirming or voting to confirm.
Awesome. And I have a map of DC dogs behind me, so I'm extremely pro dog. No worries. Great. Thank you for setting that context for all of us. I want to talk a little bit about the role that organizing plays in that process. I think for many of us, and I'll speak as a non-lawyer, someone who organizes in lots of different arenas, not just around law, the process of becoming a judge, having someone be nominated, the Supreme Court, can feel really distant. And organizing is all about an individual who wants to make a change in their community, getting involved in making that change. So could you talk a little bit about the role that organizing has played in bringing us to this particular point? We've spoken about the opportunities, the challenges. These are not new problems. There is a long history of organizing that has gone into the prioritization of certain issues in our Supreme Court, that has, around our courts in general, that have left the courts out of step with the majority of Americans. And so I would love if each of you could speak to what role organizing and systems change have played in bringing us to this particular point in our courts and our democracy. And I think we're at Rachel first.
I'm happy to give you just a specific example of just like the power of organizing. I think that can like happen if we actually do try and form like a dedicated coalition to things. That would be the clearest example in an election would be Wisconsin. I think in terms of realizing the power that youth have in elections as like one of the fastest growing voting blocks, I think, and the power that they have. Like youth turnout was wildly insane, I think, in Wisconsin this past year. For example, I think in a precinct at the University of Wisconsin campus, it went from having 100 votes cast in an election to times like 8 times that number. So I think it was almost over 1,000 or close to 1,000 votes cast in that one precinct. So to have that type of increase is almost like unprecedented in terms of that. But that also took, and what resulted in that is the Wisconsin Supreme Court switching partisan control for the first time in over 15 years. And that takes and that does take actual investment and realization that the courts do matter, and that they are a way to legitimize, I think, our democracy, and in terms of ensuring that our democracy represents people and that we have policies in place that are protecting individuals' rights as well.
Great, Tristin.
I'm just going to put a damper on it a little bit. Sorry in advance. Also, just want to pull out the organizing that has been happening over the past few decades on the right as an example of how we've gotten to where we are in our current court system. I think the most striking example is the Dobbs case, for example. We didn't get to a world where one day the Supreme Court justices woke up and said, we're going to overturn Roe v. Wade today. That was the direct result of just decades long organizing from the Federalist Society. We've seen organizing, especially as brought out through ProPublica's reporting, the Leonard Leo Network, the Koch Network, where there's been a lot of work behind the scenes. And I think it can be argued that it's been really effective work in organizing to get judges in these places and in these positions on these benches to be able to be positioned to rule on these cases in particular ways. And so I just want to point that out as a reminder, but also as just when people think about organizing, like folks don't realize like some of this stuff is long term. Like it's going to take us a while to get back on track, and you can't be discouraged by that. The right certainly has.
Oh, I think we lost Tristin, but I was about to add a carry-on point of that. So,
oh, wait, I think I might be coming back.
Okay, I hear you.
Okay, I'm going to stop my camera and then start it back. Okay.
Go for it.
Go for it.
Or I'll just stop my camera and keep talking. So I wanted to use that as an example, but also I think another example that's important to bring out is a lot of the strides we've seen the Biden administration make, specifically as it relates to increasing the professional diversity we've seen in a lot of the federal judicial nominees and now judges that have seen. That has also been something that has taken a lot of organizing by advocacy groups to push for. This has really been the first time, I think, in modern history that we've seen such an intentional and explicit push to get more public interest attorneys, civil rights attorneys, legal aid lawyers, labor lawyers, so on and so forth on the bench. And so I just wanted to kind of like highlight that dichotomy to show that there is power in organizing. It just depends on what type of organizing you're interested in doing, what causes you're most passionate about and interested in pushing forward. But if we all can kind of put our heads together and do it collectively, it can be pretty effective.
Yeah, Tristin, thank you for that. Oh, I'm not killing you. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I think we should call a spade. And I really appreciate that comment. The folks who have been trying to organize and mobilize around issues like abortion access, things that are the majority of Americans think should be available to most Americans under most circumstances, that took a long time, a lot of investment, and a lot of patience. Those of us who are on the social justice, pro-democracy end of this conversation, speaking from personal experience, I've seen the ways in which we are deeply reactive. We see the Dobbs memo get leaked, we mobilize very quickly, and then we dissipate. We don't have long-term funding, long-term planning. We got here through the patience of not even a bunch of people, a few people with a lot of resources and time and strategy. And that's the kind of long-term thinking that is going to be required for us to bring the judicial system back to a place where it is more representative of the majority of Americans. So I really appreciate that, Tristin. And I also want to level that to the audience. You know, you all out there in the world, I want you to think about how it is that you term work. I have the joy and the sorrow of working with a lot of young people. And I say sorrow because they feel this tension in our democracy. They feel the economic equality. They feel the distinction, the difference between their values and the values that they see represented in the court system. And I have to stand in front of 19-year-olds and tell them that the world that they want is coming, but it's going to take a long time. And I hate having to tell them that. It is probably the worst part of my job. And we have an opportunity to start that investment, to start changing the way that we think about fighting for these issues by investing over the long term, by continuing to show up all the time. That's the work that we do at Rising Organizers, is create those opportunities for people. But I really want to make that call to action to all of you who are concerned about this issue. This is not a short-term problem. This is a long-term problem that it requires all of us for that long term, so that I can be a little more optimistic with the teams. That said, I would love, this is another call for Q&A. So if you have any questions at this point, please drop them in the in the chat. If you've got comments, that's fine too. We'll react to them. We're chatty Cathy's over here, and really appreciate your comments so far. So the last question I want to pose in front of you two before we get into the formal Q&A section is around ethics at the court. And we've talked about this, and I think it's a really live issue, both because it seems like new news reports are happening around it every day, and also because it really demonstrates some of the insularity that exists, particularly at the Supreme Court, from matters of judicial ethics. And so would love to talk about, and Tristin, this might be the place for you to start. How are you thinking about how the lack of ethics reform is going to manifest itself in the upcoming term? And then, oh, Tristin, could you mute for, sorry, for some reason when I, thank you, sorry. And question for both of you, how can young people take a more active role in organizing for court ethics reform? What are the conversations that I could bring to the college students that I work with who are really frustrated because they see progress in some issues and then they see the Supreme Court immediately squash them? So Tristin, if you could speak a little bit, and I apologize for the technical difficulties on my end, if you could speak a little bit to how the lack of ethics reform is going to play out over the next term and what young people or all of us can do to organize around it.
No worries at all. I think 3 years in Zoom world, I'm not shocked as much when tech issues arise. So apologies about that again. But to your first question, Elyssa, I think that there's like a pretty stark example. You mentioned how the court's term started earlier this week on Monday. And one of the big cases coming down this term that groups, including PPP, are calling for Justice Clarence Thomas specifically to recuse himself from is Loper Bright Enterprises v. Raimondo. And Loper is pretty much a case that is asking the court to overturn its longstanding precedent of the Chevron doctrine, going back to this pattern that we've seen from the court of just being willing to mow down its own precedent. So we have that happening again here in Loper this term. And the Chevron doctrine is a doctrine that has pretty much provided our expert agencies latitude to put various regulations like environmental and health regulations into effect. And so the case has been orchestrated by the Koch network, a network I mentioned pretty recently, but this is also a network Justice Thomas has been connected to as recently as 2018 per ProPublica's reporting. And so that's just one example of how the lack of ethics reforms at the court specifically will manifest themselves and have continued to manifest themselves. This is not Justice Thomas's first time being asked to recuse himself from cases. This is not the first time that Justice Alito has been asked to recuse himself from cases. And so it's a pattern and it's a problem that we see is kind of running rampant in the court. And there's not really much we can do about it at this point because there's no binding code of ethics on the Supreme Court. All the other federal courts have binding codes of ethics, which should, in my opinion, be the very bare minimum. But if that does not even exist in the highest court in the land, of course, they're not going to feel incentivized to do things like be honest about what their conflicts of interest are and when they should step down from cases. In fact, especially, if you have been following ProPublica's reporting, when they have these very, very strong financial and political conflicts of interest, it almost feels like there are these golden handcuffs on them to somehow get to a place where they can rule on certain cases in certain ways. And so we've seen that as the lack of transparency there. Also the lack of transparency where they don't really have anything governing when they should be. There is something that governs it, but it's not really binding, which is like the teeth part of it. But, going back to Justice Thomas, we've seen financial disclosure forms where he's leaving out really huge pieces of financial disclosures that should be included in his documentation. But, if there's nothing that's saying you will be XYZ, if you don't do XYZ, then of course they're not going to do XYZ. And so those are a couple of ways that we see it manifesting. In terms of what young people specifically can be doing, I think that there is a lot of power. I feel like it sounds cliche, but like social media has been a huge proponent, in my opinion, at least, of how we've kind of seen this veil being lifted off of the court, just this constant pressuring, at least publicly on the court, I think has resulted, at least last term or the last couple of terms, in the court kind of having its own PR tour, which is something that I don't think has been super common with the Supreme Court, where justices like Justice Alito feel compelled to write op-eds in media publications, responding to these things. And so I think young people have the best handle and leverage on things like social media. I'll also just, speaking of op-eds, plug like the power in just like using your pen or your keyboard to write about issues that you care about. And you don't have to be published in the New York Times or the Washington Post. In fact, I think it's a bit more powerful to really leverage your local publications, your state publications about issues, especially related to state courts, but even federal courts and national issues, leveraging your local publications who are often looking for stories, who are often benefiting from just like learning about these issues because someone in the community is just like randomly following the issue and has become super knowledgeable about it, and decided to just kind of like write about it. And then that turns into a snowball effect in some cases. You can even self-publish yourself on publications or mediums like Medium, if you don't, feel comfortable pitching your stuff to an external source, or you are having trouble getting pitched. But I think those are a couple of ways that I think folks can engage, that don't feel super burdensome, but can still be really, really meaningful.
Great. Thank you, Tristin. Rachel, go ahead.
Sure. I do want to back up, I think, out of like the federal Supreme Court ethics, and kind of talk about, I think, the two recent attacks on liberal justices that we've seen out of state courts, and actually, ironically, weaponizing ethics as like a way to attack these justices for actually just speaking truthfully about issues. I think one thing I want to highlight is, and tie it into more so things that young people can do in terms of holding individuals accountable. I think with the power that they have either on social media, like Tristin said, in terms of writing, and actually just like talking about it with other people, because I think once you actually hear the things that are going on, it's really shocking. I think so. One example that I'm going to talk about is down in North Carolina. Supreme Court Justice Anita Earls recently spoke about a report that was talking about the diversity of individuals appearing before the North Carolina Supreme Court even, and just kind of the lack of diversity, I think, in terms of the litigators before them. They were majority male, majority white, and then also how that kind of reflects back into the delivering of justice and the decisions and the effects on decision making that happens in the court. But then because of those comments that she made as the only Black woman, I think, on the North Carolina Supreme Court too, she brings a unique lens, I think, to just in her lived experiences, and calling out, I think, why diversity is important, I think, in those back chambers as well. She was attacked by the Judicial Standards Commission, which is led by the Chief Justice of that court. And so it's actually just kind of ironic that then the Chief Justice is able to launch an attack against his own justices for speaking out on something that actually really is important, because we've known, and studies and research have proven, that decision making is better when more opportunities and diverse thoughts are brought to bear. So I think it's Sandra Day O'Connor who famously was talking about Thurgood Marshall's impact, I think, in terms of having him as another voice in chambers and making decisions because of the experience that he brought to the court, advocating and fighting on behalf of the rights of underrepresented communities in our government. It would be an echo chamber if we didn't have those. But that being said, like, now those are like that very thought process and that very like principle of diversity of thought even is being attacked on its end and being weaponized by ethics. And so I think it's more so about being vigilant, and tapping into organizations like AFJ, like PPP, and other organizations like that are mobilizing around the court. So Tristin mentioned Demand Justice earlier, and then also just looking at other litigating organizations that are going before these courts to stay up to date on kind of what is going on and what the issues are before the bench and what these judges are deciding on.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, that really resonates with me too. The advice that I always feel like I'm giving young people is to be persistent. That these are, to comments we've already made, these are problems that take a long time to solve. And more than that, they take consistent public pressure. Often, in my experience, I see a lot of one-off, one-day mobilizations of a group of people to protest something, and then those people disappear into the background. Some organizations are really good at not doing this. I'm not making a blanket statement, but I have seen it happen quite a bit around issues of democracy, issues of the court system, this problem in North Carolina, the gerrymandering that it has completely misaligned our democratic process in a bunch of different states. These things require consistency and they require people power. And that's really where organizing becomes incredibly important. Organizing is something that has been used to combat challenging governments, to put it lightly, since the beginning of time. This is one of the best tools that we have at our disposal for saying that as a people, we will not stand for something. And also, it only works when there are a lot of us saying that, and saying it a lot. If you have 5 people who show up at an event to protest and then are never heard from again, that is going to have those people, that issue, categorized as a nuisance, as opposed to if you have 5 people and then 50 people and then 100 people and you continue to grow, then those people become not a nuisance, but an actual organization, people who need to be reckoned with. That requires building relationships with people in your community who agree with you, making sure that you have a clear idea of what you want, continuing to be able to show up and turn out for moments of crisis. This is hard, right? This gets to Tristin's point of requiring a long window, a long timeline for this. But I think what both of you have said really highlights the importance of organizing, not just as a one-off event, but as something that is deeply consistent and part of our fight for a stronger and more representative democracy. Another reminder, please put your questions in the chat. We have a little StreamYard note at the bottom here. Would love to hear what it is that you all would love to talk about. I have a first question here about resources to learn more. So for people who are newer to court world, what are some resources for them to check out? How can they learn more? Who should they be following on social, podcasts, all of that? Where can people start to ground their new expertise in the courts?
I think in terms of podcast, I always recommend the 5-4 podcast and Strict Scrutiny podcast. I think are two of the top podcasts that are probably most helpful when it comes to breaking down what the cases are that are being heard at the Supreme Court specifically. I know Rachel will probably plug AFJ's resource, so I will not do that. But PPP, we've released a couple of state court reports that kind of do some assessments of the professional diversity or lack thereof on benches. So we've released reports about Wisconsin and Georgia. We'll be releasing a report related to Arizona, I think near the end of this month. Some time ago, People for the American Way, another great advocacy group, released a really great report, I think called A Glimmer of Hope, that looked at the kind of practical consequences of some of those professionally diverse nominees we've seen come out of the Biden administration who are now judges, and just seeing how they're ruling from the bench to really concretize for people just like, it's not something we're just saying or calling for to have more professionally diverse nominees or attorneys become judges, but to really see like how that looks in practice. And so that's a really useful resource, I think. I wrote a report for PPP earlier this year that probably needs to be updated in terms of data because more people have been confirmed since then. But that just took a look at the first 2 years of President Biden's administration and just kind of looking at the raw data there in terms of nominees and judges who were confirmed from this administration specifically, and talking some more about other court reform issues. So I think that hopefully can be a decent resource. But I will let Rachel follow up on the state courts tip.
I second Tristin's recommendations for Strict Scrutiny and 5-4, two of the best legal podcasts out there, in my opinion, as well. But then in terms of like things just to read up on, AFJ, our president, Rakeem Brooks, has a column in Democracy Docket that he talks about like how the intersection, I think, of our democracy and democratic systems and institutions intersect kind of with the courts and judge and like who sits on there. If you want to think about professional diversity, let's think about getting movement attorneys on like and movement judges like appointed and confirmed to our courts, get the change, people who have been in the communities and like, and we can include that and a little explainer about kind of what that is and why that's important in the follow-up as well. Follow along with like AFJ's website, our State Court Justice Project, to learn more about the way that justices are selected in your state, and then also kind of when the next opportunity to weigh in on your state Supreme Court could be. Bolts Magazine does some really excellent reporting of state court issues and cases that are going before the courts. The Brennan Center has the State Court Report, which is a new, I think, spin-off little microsite that they have specifically focused on litigation and just reports on diversity of the state courts. Follow United for Democracy, which is a newer coalition of organizations focused around, I think, calling out and fighting the corruption that we're seeing on our federal courts, especially coming out of the Supreme Court. And then, as I said, kind of just some other litigating organizations. So think about like your Planned Parenthood, Center for Reproductive Rights, Lambda Legal, National Women's Law Center, Earth Justice, the Lawyers Committee, NAACP, LDF, everything along those lines as well.
Great. Thanks, team. I will advocate for the More Perfect podcast, which is less commentary and more of a historical study of major cases, but it is one of the few podcasts to make me cry. And it went on hiatus for several years and then surprisingly came back this year. So I am a very big fan. Okay, we have a question in the chat. Why should people donate to state court races in their states in 2024 versus the presidential elections? And of course, people can do both. But how would you talk to someone who was trying to prioritize how to best, or trying to prioritize why they should donate to state court races?
State court, because they are I feel like they are just under people's radars, you know. I generally speaking, voter participation in them is in those types of elections is down, and that just comes down to not having the resources to actually be able to get your name out there as a candidate, or even just get the voter education on the importance of those races in general. Your dollars can also go a lot longer and a lot farther in a state-based election, I think, than a national one as well. These state court races are really kind of like do or die for our rights next year, as we've seen, as the Supreme Court is really dead set on just reversing more and more of their precedent to just push forward their agenda from the bench. Right now, the state courts are critical opportunities where you can donate and have more of an impact and a direct also impact for your communities as well. Because even if things go awry at the federal level, state constitutions and state can be actually more progressive than our federal constitution actually can be. And so that way there you have so many more opportunities to effectively shape your courts there.
Tristin, anything you want to add?
Not much that I'd add, but I just want to reiterate, Rachel gave the statistic earlier, like 95% of litigation is coming through state courts. So I know we talk a lot about federal courts and the Supreme Court a lot, but in terms of the courts that are providing access to justice on a daily basis for folks that they feel probably most closely, when you think about things like landlord-tenant eviction cases, just so many of those kind of just day-to-day things that impact people a lot more than things that may be coming out of federal courts are impacting them are coming out of state courts. And so I think it's been great to see state courts getting kind of like this renewed focus and attention, especially when the increasing hostility we see in our federal courts. We've seen state courts in different states this year alone really step up in ways. Going back to the abortion example, after Dobbs came down, we saw a lot of these ballot measures in states. We've seen a lot of state courts step in and say, okay, even though this is a constitutional right, the Supreme Court is taking away, which is crazy to say still. We're going to step in and provide stronger protections, at least for residents in our state. And so state courts are really, really important places to strengthen constitutional guarantees or to strengthen rights that may be taken away, but just like reiterating, this is where most litigation is happening.
So definitely a place of getting more bang for your buck. Your dollars can go so far on a smaller race, and would really encourage folks to think about how they think about their giving in that way. And final question, the three of us are organizers. I want to leave our audience with some immediate next steps, a call to action. So I'm curious what folks can do, what would you recommend after they leave this conversation to push for court ethics, a diverse judiciary, a more representative democracy? What suggestions do you all have for them? And Tristin, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So definitely I can speak to the diverse judiciary point. Like, it's so not hard to engage on this, even though, Elyssa, I think you brought up a good point about it feeling so distant because it just feels like such an esoteric topic that there's just not a lot of information on. And maybe that's by design or maybe not. But when there's a vacancy that comes up, you can follow along with vacancies that arise in your state. I think AFJ has another great resource where you can just kind of track how many vacancies are open in your state. But you can lobby your senators in your state to recommend more professionally diverse folks to the bench. A lot of times they're just not hearing from people about this because this is just not something that people know about. Like when a vacancy arises and their application goes live, that those are always great opportunities to do some advocacy, just generally, but especially if you know people in your life, professionally or personally, who you think would make excellent additions to the bench. Like really almost pester, harass these people to seriously consider a career on the bench. I think similarly to that statistic that I'm sure many of us have heard, where you have to ask women specifically like a number of times to run for office before they actually do it. I think the same is true for public interest attorneys specifically, because prior to this administration, like I've said, there really was not a feasible pathway for public interest attorneys, or at least a documented pathway to get from that type of career to a career either on a state court bench or a federal court bench. And so really just like pushing folks to consider it, to go after it, and just showing or, referencing the many examples we've seen come out of this administration, like Julie Rickleman, who was a longtime lawyer with the Center for Reproductive Rights, who is now a judge on the First Circuit, Nancy Abudu, who did a lot of really wonderful voting rights work with the Southern Poverty Law Center, who's now a sitting judge for the 11th Circuit, Dale Ho, another great voting rights lawyer who is a judge for the Southern District of New York. It's happening. We need more. We want more. And so if you know people, just encourage them to consider it. And we're always happy to talk to folks who may be interested and just want more information. So I'll say that and pass it to Rachel.
Endorsing everything Tristin said. Those conversations are just so important because sometimes it can be hard. When you've seen benches, both at the state and federal level, dominated by prosecutors, dominated by corporate attorneys, it's hard to find a way or even see a possible path to the bench. Not only are campaigns expensive and those attorneys tend to be more resourced and have easier connections to get the resources, we need to have those conversations to actually shift who we're seeing as or potential judges. I think the right has done that job, as Tristin kind of said earlier. They've put ideologues on the bench. You have Amy Coney Barrett on the bench, and you have Wendy Bitter, for example, someone who said birth control causes breast cancer. That's just not true, And so it's the thought of who is like fair and impartial or who is qualified has been just shifted so far. And so it's time really to see yourself and step up and have those conversations with folks, encourage them. You have the network, I think now progressives are really looking up to the importance of professional diversity. And so I think the system, like we are creating networks to support these types of people in terms of seeing themselves as judges. So start your conversations just about who these types of judges should be, but also start conversations about your state courts. Go to AFJ's State Court Justice Project and see and figure out how your judges are elected or selected in your state. If they're elected, make sure your parents know about that. Make sure your neighbors know about that. Make sure your best friend knows about that. And make sure that they know when these elections are coming up, and find information about these candidates. Really figure out, have they dedicated their careers to fighting for equal justice? Have they been a former public defender, or have they spent their careers fighting for corporations and the wealthy and powerful their entire time, or are they on the side of working people? And so I think that's something you need to do. It's just like build up that education and make sure that your friends and your family are aware as well.
Great. Thanks for that, Rachel. And what you were saying just really made me think about really a core concept in organizing that we've talked around, but that we should name, which is power. We've talked a lot about the ways in which conservatives have spent a long time investing their power their people, their money in shaping a judiciary that is reflective of their values and their positions, even though that is out of step with the majority of Americans. And the thing I always say as an organizer, and I'll ground my next steps in organizing because that's how I am, is that we don't want to cede any area in which power is happening. We don't want to leave any areas in which we are not playing. Because if we're not there, if the majority of us are not there, then the minority of us, those of us who do not have the kinds of pro-democracy, social justice orientation that is documented to be the majority of Americans, are going to be there. And so I will leave you all with a call to action, which is to learn what organizing is. And I'll make that a little bit easier because I know that's really broad, and tell you all that if you sign up for Rising Organizers email list, you actually will get a introductory one pager about organizing and how you can get started in your community right now. Organizing can feel like a really broad, esoteric concept, but it really is just finding people who agree with you, figuring out how you can get to work on an issue you care about, and making sure that you keep going. And that's my job, is to make that a more accessible process for all of you. So that will be my call to action for all of you. I want to thank all of you who were watching today for your time and your questions. I appreciate the nice comments in the comment box. And of course, Tristin and Rachel, you are both angels. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise in our conversation today.
Thanks, y'all. I don't want to do the echo thing, but thanks, Elyssa and Rachel. This has been a really wonderful conversation, and I'm glad that we were able to have it. I hope folks found it to be useful and valuable, and I'm sure we will be talking about this for a while.
Yes, definitely going to be on this a while. Sorry, Rachel, go ahead.
No, you're good. Just saying thank you. And I hope everyone becomes courts advocates after this, both at the federal level and state level. Little court organizers too.
Yeah, this is my little court organizer dance. I'm rolling it out today. Thanks all. Appreciate you.